Thank you very much. Would you be able to go into more detail about the concept you were speaking of, twinning towns and areas?
Oh, it's not necessarily towns and areas, but on a numerical basis, saying, well, we will resettle some refugees, 50 for 50, say, if you can locally integrate, or at least grant people the right to work and their children the right to education while they wait for one of these very scarce resettlement places to open up. That could have an impact on the desire of people to get out of a very insecure situation, get on a boat and risk their lives coming to Australia. So I think it's something worth trying at least. Okay, does that explain?
Yes,
yep.
Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. I wanted to ask you, you made a comparison between the budget emergency and the boat arrival emergency. And I remember that prior to the last election that Howard was in, which he actually lost, we had an emergency in Indigenous communities. I can't help thinking that was a bit of a huge beat up, and I'd love to know what your view is, because it seemed to me that he was trying to win that election in the same way that he won the Children Overboard election. What do you think?
Look, I think there possibly is an element, and it's not to say that issues of child abuse are not important. They clearly are. But it's interesting that the focus was on Indigenous communities and not the wider community, where you might say, particularly when we've got a royal commission happening, you might say it's a problem that's been endemic in the country in many, many ways. I do think politicians like to create a moral panic about an issue, present it as an emergency, arrogate to themselves special powers, and it allows them to get away with murder. Yep.
Further questions, colleagues? Yes, over here.
Thanks for an excellent presentation. In recent weeks there has been the argument coming from the conservative press that there are many of, particularly the Sri Lankan refugees, are economic refugees, that they are coming here only to seek work. Where does that fit into the framework?
Well, as a lawyer, I think if you think people may be refugees or they may not be refugees, you have a fair process and you find out. And if people really are not refugees, yes, you can send them back to their country of origin. What I think is interesting about Australia's procedures is that we've adopted very expedited procedures. I mean, we don't know enough about what's happening with that boatload of Sri Lankans on the high seas at the moment, but from reports it sounds as though they're being asked 4 rudimentary questions via video link, without interpreters, without lawyers, on the high seas. This is not a process that's going to do a good job of finding out or distinguishing between those who might be coming for work, and of course it's entirely possible. I mean, I don't think we should underestimate how desperate people can be when they're trying to survive. I'd prefer them to call them survival migrants instead of economic refugees or economic migrants. But legally, they are treated differently to those fleeing persecution. So we should have a procedure that is fair, and there should be an appeal right as well.
Thanks, Penny. We've got a question here in the middle.
Hello, and thank you very much for your talk. It was fantastic. My name's Hannah, and I'm from Queensland Labor for Refugees. I'm on the Executive Committee, and I joined Labor last year when Manus Island was announced, because I got angry enough with Labor to join them, which sounds perverse to some people, and many would argue that we've got our work cut out for us. I'm interested in a couple of things you said. First was when you discussed the Vietnamese refugees and how they were resettled in Canada, Australia and the US. And you said it wasn't just, you said that it was a reaction possibly to communism and that it may not happen again. I seem to recall that Malcolm Fraser has recently said it was because of Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. And I just wonder, why hasn't that argument been brought up recently with Afghanistan and Iraq? Because I would see, well, Afghanistan, you could argue either way, and I've got Afghani friends who are very glad that there were the Allied forces that went in. But with Iraq, certainly we could argue that it was a mistake. And why are we not hearing that from our leaders now or from prominent thinkers? You don't see anything like that in the papers.
You may not see it in the Australian papers, I
No,
agree, but
or the
there have
Australian
been
in particular.
there have been non-government organisations running the argument, particularly in the United States, in relation to Iraq and Afghanistan, that it's a moral responsibility similar to Vietnam. I do wonder whether the legacy of the Cold War made that moral argument have some more strength in that context, because it is very interesting that we're not taking the same approach today, even though in so many ways you can argue it's a mistake. There was illegality involved with the invasion of Iraq, violation of international law, didn't get Security Council authorisation. So you could make the same kinds of arguments, but yes, they're not having the same force today as they did back then. It's very true.
Any other questions, Paul?
Do I have time? Or?
Yeah.
Oh no, it's gone out of my head.
Put your hand up when it comes back. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. Thank you very much. That was a fascinating lecture. I really enjoyed it. My first question has to do with those visa categories in Australia which are provided for people whose claims are under determination, that often they don't have work rights.
Yes.
And I was wondering about where that sits in terms of what you're talking about with regards to the convention. Secondly, I was curious about what kinds of rights to natural justice do refugees and asylum seekers have in the Australian context. I understand that there's consideration of removing right to access to the Refugee Review Tribunal it's anyway under consideration. And finally, when there is a determination that someone must return, what are Australia's obligations in that instance, in terms of currently a whole range of services are withdrawn from those individuals? So I'm curious about those things.
So I'll try and remember the three questions. I wish I had a pen to write them down. So first of all is the bridging visas that asylum seekers have been put on, while procedures were frozen and various other idiotic things happened. And yes, they're often without work rights. Well, under the convention, a determination of refugee status merely declares that you are a refugee. It's not constitutive of the fact that you're a refugee. And obviously those asylum seekers have a lawful status in Australia when they're on a bridging visa. And so they should be given work rights. I think there's a pretty strong argument that we're really just trying to fudge it in order to deny people who may well be refugees the right to work. And of course there are other human rights obligations that come into play. So we're also a party to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which protects the right to work in Article 6. And what is the basis on which we could say that a limitation on that right for this very vulnerable category was somehow appropriate? I don't actually think that Australia would be successful if they were asked questions about this by the committee that supervises that treaty either. So I think we are in violation of international law by keeping people in this limbo instead of getting on and determining their status and granting them work rights if they are successful. So that's the answer to the first part of your question. Now, can I remember the second part? Natural justice. One of the problems in Australia, I think, is that we do not have a Bill of Rights. And so what Parliament gives, it can take away. It cannot take away the original jurisdiction of the High Court, so I think it's probably ill-advised to keep removing access to various things that are going to keep asylum seekers from going to the High Court. But yes, you can kind of fiddle around with the system, so that's an unfortunate reality. And the final part of the question is, What do we owe to quote unquote failed asylum seekers, as they're often called, in terms of access to social services and so on? My point is that those people are human beings as well, and they are owed human rights. And so you cannot simply allow someone to become destitute if, for example, you cannot actually remove the person, because it's often not the case that they're just being obstreperous. They simply cannot be removed because they can't get documentation. They're stateless, for example. They can't return home even though they're not a refugee, and we don't have a legal obligation in that sense. But we still owe them basic human rights. Yep.
Just maybe one follow-up question, given the theme of regionalism, and given that we live in the Asian century, what about some of our Asian neighbours to the north, countries of China, Japan, etc.? What's their role to some of the refugees?
Well, interestingly, both the countries you've mentioned are actually party to the Refugee Convention, but China doesn't actually implement it properly. And Japan has a very low rate of recognising refugees. It can do a lot in terms of providing finance and so on, and I think it should be encouraged in that direction. I think actually Japan is one of the countries that we could try and bring on board and share responsibility. China, perhaps we'd have less ability to get them on board. Yeah, it's a great question.
Colleagues, we have time for one last question, right here.
I'm Chris Miranda. I come from Logan. We run an organization there to help refugees in Logan. As you know, Logan is an area where we have about 600 refugees, I think, at the moment. Now, two short questions. One is, asylum seekers deemed to be not refugees are being sent back, although they may claim that they are in danger if they go back. What is the government's obligation? What is the legal obligation to somebody who is being sent back, and if something happens to them, is there an obligation on the government to continue to see what their fate is when they return? The other short question, if you may allow me,
Sure.
is that Australia is a signatory to the UN's Convention for Refugees, and I think there is a conflict of opinion there, where they say what they are doing is within the rights of the convention. They are not infringing on that responsibility.
I would agree with the second one. There are many examples where Australia is in fact in violation of the Refugee Convention and of other human rights treaties that protect the rights of refugees and asylum seekers. And the fact that the government says it isn't violation should not be taken as at face value. I mean, we are often criticised by independent monitors of these bodies. The United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees has been very vocal criticising our policies, and various other UN bodies that supervise human rights treaties have criticised us as well. The first question is much more difficult to answer, I think. So if a person really is not a refugee, even though they may feel afraid of going back, if it isn't well founded, if the evidence really doesn't support the person's claim, then they can be sent back. There is no legal obligation to them. If we have a very dodgy procedure, and that's why people are being turned back, then we have violated the Refugee Convention. And the unfortunate thing about this is that once someone's been sent back to irreparable harm, it's done, you know, and there really isn't a lot we can do for that person in terms of trying to provide reparation even. Can we find the person? Are they dead? You know, it is such an important decision, and it really speaks to the question asked before about, you know, what sort of standards should we put in place to make sure we don't make the wrong decision. And unfortunately, it does seem as though our government's quite prepared to make the wrong decision by adopting procedures that are bound to fail to recognise real refugees. So I hope that answers your question.